Hey there, folks. Let's ease into the night, shall we? Laugh tonight, we re-diving into a story that's all about slow, steady moments, like just sort of like the kind that make your eyelids feel heavy and your mind start to unwind. But before we drift off, if this vibe says your thing, do me a favor, hit that like button, maybe even subscribe. No pressure though, just only if you mean it. And hey, let me know where you retuning in from. Drop a comment with your city and the time over there. It's wild to think we all under the same moon, just in different corners of the world. Now let's just set the scene, dim the lights a little, laugh. So maybe just enough to see the outline of your bed. If you vet a fan, flip it on. That soft word, perfect background noise. Ready? Let's let the story carry us away, nice and slow. Imagine waking up like at dawn, like rubbing sleep from your eyes, and knowing the entire day will be spent hunched over a desk, copying words by hand. No breaks for fresh air, no chatting with colleagues, laugh, just the scratch of a quill, and the occasional drip of ink. That was what life was like for scribes before the printing press came along. These poor souls weren't just writers. They were like human photocopiers, and their job was just about as exciting as watching paint dry. In ancient times, if you wanted a book, you had to find someone willing to spend weeks or months rewriting it. Take the monasteries in medieval Europe, for example. Monks would hole up in dimly lit rooms called scriptoria, their fingers stained with iron gall ink, painstakingly copying every letter of the Bible. A single copy could take a whole year to finish, and that sight if they didn't just mess up. One wrong stroke, and they'd have to start over. Laugh just unto some no resort more. Z back then, no wonder some monks snuck in little doodles in the margins. Even holy men need to stay awake somehow. And it wasn't that just slow, laugh. So uncut, it was really expensive. Paper or parchment made from animal skin cost a fortune. A single Bible might use 300 sheepskins, which meant only kings, nobles, and churches could afford one. Common people, laugh. Forget it. Like literally, most people never laid eyes on a book in their entire lives. Knowledge was locked away, like a secret kept by the elite. If you wanted to learn something, you either had to memorize what a teacher told you or beg to peek at a rare manuscript. Over in Asia, laugh, things weren't much better. Chinese scribes copied texts onto bamboo strips or silk, which were heavy and hard to store. Imagine trying to carry around a library just made of bamboo, so UV break, sort of UV break, sort of UV break. Like Unki, it would take a cart just to hold a few books. Japanese monks copied Buddhist sutras by hand, their hands cramping from the tiny, precise characters. Everywhere you looked, the act of sharing ideas was tied to the speed of a whole human hand. Laugh, the worst part, mistakes spread like wildfire, like a scribe tired from a long day might misspell a word, and before anyone knew it, that mistake would end up like in dozens of copies. One famous example is a medieval Bible where the word not was left out of a commandment, turning thou shalt not commit adultery into thou shalt commit adultery. The church wasn't so too happy about that one. Scribes were also prone to adding their own flair. A bored copyist might change a story sessioning or add a snarky comment in the margins. So over time, texts morphed like a game of telephone. By the time a book reached someone so far away, it might barely resemble the original. Life for these scribes was a mix of drudgery and pressure. They were respected for their skill, but just let's be real, laugh. Like just real spending years copying the same text over and over can have been thrilling. Little did they know, a revolution was brewing in Europe, one that would make their tedious jobs obsolete. But just for now, the world waited. One slow ink-stained page at a time. Let's talk about the stuff we write on Laugh, Unka, because before we could even think about printing, we first had to figure out how to capture words in the first place.
Spoiler, it took humanity thousands of years to stop using materials that were either way too heavy, way too expensive, or just plain weird. Take ancient Mesopotamia, for example, around 3500 BC. People laugh. They were writing on clay tablets. They'd press a stylus into wet clay, so let it dry, and boom, like unky, you had a book. But try carrying a library of clay tablets around. Each one weighed as much as a brick, and a single story might need dozens of them. Laugh. Plus, if it rained, your precious words turned into mud. Not exactly ideal for just spreading ideas. Over in Egypt, they came up with something lighter, papyrus, made from the stems of the papyrus plant. So it was like the first version of paper. You just peeled the stems, laid them out in layers, mashed them together, and let them dry. It worked better than clay, but it was still a hassle. Papyrus was brittle, tore easily, and didn't hold up so well in humid places. And since it only grew along the Nile, getting it to other parts of the world was pricey. A single roll of papyrus could cost a day's wages for a laborer. Like just so again, only the rich could afford to write so much. Then there's a parchment, which sounds pretty fancy, but is basically dried animal skin. The process was gross, so you just soak a sheep, goat, or calf skin in lime, scrape off the hair, stretch it, and dry it. The result was durable, sure, but let's do the math. A big book might need 50 skins. A Bible, laugh, up to 300. That meant a single copy of the Bible could cost as much as a house. No wonder medieval churches locked their books away like treasure, they practically were. In China, things took a different turn. For centuries, people wrote on bamboo strips. They decarve characters into thin strips of bamboo, then tie them together with string to make a scroll. It was so cheap. But imagine trying to read a long text. Laugh, you'd just have to unroll a strip as long as a person, and if the string broke, your book turned into like a pile of sticks. Later, they moved to silk, which was lighter and smoother. But silk was even more expensive than parchment. Like writing a book on silk was like writing on a bedsheet today. Laugh, like sort of unbeautiful, but totally impractical for everyday use. Then just around 105, a Chinese court official named Kai Lun had a pretty bright idea. He mixed mulberry bark, hemp rags, and water, mashed it into a pulp, spread it on a screen, and let it dry. Voila, laugh, like onca paper, it was cheaper than silk, lighter than bamboo, and easier to make than papyrus. By the 7th century, paper making had spread to Korea, Japan, and by the 12th century, it reached Europe. But even with paper, there was still a problem, so you still had to write everything by hand. Paper made words lighter, but not faster to produce. Each of these materials had its flaws. Clay was heavy. Papyrus was fragile. Parchment was expensive. Bamboo was clunky. They all kind of put limits on how many books could actually exist and who could own them. A farmer in 13th century France might never see a book because the cost of parchment alone priced him out. A merchant in India might hear about a new idea, but couldn't he just read about it because the paper needed to copy it was just too rare. That's pretty easy to take paper for granted. Now laugh, sort of like on cue. We scribble notes on it, print essays, wrap leftovers in it. But for most of human history, just having a surface to write on was a luxury. And until we solved that problem, the next big step, just like a problem. The next big leap, though. The stage was set, though, by the 1400s. Paper was becoming more common in Europe, thanks to trade with the East. It was like the world was waiting with blank pages, ready for someone to figure out how to fill them faster. While Europe was still stuck in the age of hand, copied manuscripts over in East Asia, so people were already experimenting with a clever idea. So why not create movable letters that can be reused? Laugh, it sounds obvious now, but back then, it was revolutionary, sort of like unpua, not without its hiccups. Let's start with China, where the story begins around the 11th century. A man named Bisheng, who who lived during the Song dynasty got tired of carving entire pages into wooden blocks. So that was the common method. Then you do just carve a whole page of text into a block, ink it, and press it onto paper. The problem, once you carved a block, it was good for only one page. Laugh. If you wanted to print a new book, you had to carve all new blocks. It was just like building a new car just to drive to the store, sort of like total overkill. Bishang? Solution. Clay laugh. So he made small rectangular blocks of clay, carved a single character into each one, then baked them hard in a kiln. When he wanted to print a page, he rearranged these clay characters on a metal plate, stick them in place with wax, and then just ink them. Once he was done, he could melt the wax, take the characters apart, and reuse them for another page. Genius, right? Laugh. It's like having a set of toy letters. But for serious book like making. But here said the catch, Chinese has tens of thousands of characters. Imagine trying to store enough clay blocks to cover even a fraction of them. So maybe you do need a warehouse the size of a football field just to hold the basic. And clay, it's fragile. Drop a box of Bishang as characters and suddenly you were sweeping up horse and moon and wisdom into a dusty pile. Laugh, not exactly practical for mass production. Fast forward a few centuries to Korea where things got a metal upgrade. So in the 1300s, during the Goryeo dynasty, Korean craftsmen started making movable type out of bronze. Bronze is tough, laugh. So Unkyu could drop it, step on it, and it would still hold its shape. They even created a system where they did cast entire sets of characters at once, just using mold. By 1377, they printed a Buddhist text called the Chikiji, which is now the oldest surviving book made with movable metal type. Take the Europe laugh. So basically, you were still copying by hand when Korea was already printing like pro. The Koreans had another advantage, their writing system, Hangul, which was invented in the 1440s. Unlike Chinese, Hangul has only 24 basic letters, though some combine to make more. So storing metal type was way easier. A single cabinet could hold all the characters like you'd ever need. But even with that, movable type didn't take over in East Asia as much as you. So do you expect? For one, woodblock printing was already really good. Chinese and Korean printers had been perfecting it for centuries, so laugh, they could carve a block pretty quickly, and the results looked beautiful with elegant calligraphy. That movable type, which was more uniform, couldn't match. Plus, books in East Asia were often works of art with illustrations and decorative borders. Movable type was great for text, but not so much for fancy designs. Then there's the issue of demand. So in Europe, by the 1400s, there was a hunger for new books. Laugh, sort of like people wanted Bibles, textbooks, maps, and stories. In East Asia, the market was different. The main books being printed were classics, religious texts, and government documents. Just laugh, uncut things that did change much. If you could carve a woodblock for Confucius teachings once, you could use it for decades. No need to rearrange type when the text stayed the same. Laugh. So while Bishang and the Korean metalworkers were onto something, their inventions never quite sparked a revolution. They were like early prototypes, brilliant ideas, but missing a few key pieces. It would take someone in Europe, with a different set of problems and resources, to take movable type to the next level. But let's not discount these early tries. They proved that the idea worked so uncut that you could print without carving a whole page. Sometimes that's half the battle. If you met Johannes Gutenberg in the early 1400s, you probably wouldn't have guessed he'd change the world. He was just a regular guy in Mainz, left Germany, just uncut. Well, regular, if your idea of regular includes being a goldsmith who just dabbled in gem cutting, mirror making, and maybe a little bit of debt. But it's exactly those random skills that turned him into the father of modern printing, because sometimes the best ideas come from mixing totally unrelated things like laugh, like just uncooked. Like if someone today decided to turn a toaster into a drone crazy, maybe. But Gutenberg side version worked. Let's just start with his day job. Laugh, goldsmithing back then. Goldsmiths didn't just make jewelry. They were masters of metal, like melting it, shaping it, casting it into precise form. Gutenberg would have spent hours pouring molten metal into molds, filing down rough edges, and making sure every piece was perfect. Ever held a tiny gold ring with intricate designs, that level of precision, that's like the kind of skill that just sticks with you. And it turns out making tiny metal letters is a lot like making tiny gold trinkets. Laugh. Like unto you need steady hands, an eye for detail, and a good understanding of how metal behaves when it's hot or cold. But goldsmithing alone wasn't enough. Gutenberg was also fascinated by mechanical things. He lived in a world where people were just figuring out how to automate work, like water mills ground grain, windmills pumped water, and presses squeezed juice from grapes or oil from olives. In fact, if you walked through the countryside around Mainz, you might have seen farmers using a simple wooden press, a big beam, a platform, and a crank to squeeze whatever needed squeezing. Gutenberg probably watched those presses and thought, oh, what else can you squeeze? Oh, spoiler, it was paper and ink. Laugh. Here's the light bulb moment. The light bulbs didn't exist yet. What if you just combined the precision of metalworking with the power of a press? Laugh. Instead of squeezing grapes, you could just squeeze ink onto paper. Instead of carving a whole page into wood like the Chinese did, you could make like tiny metal letters, arrange them into words, and then press them onto paper over and over. It's like if a chef suddenly realized their pasta maker could also make Play-Doh shapes. Laugh. Like just on the same machine, just totally different use. But Gutenberg wasn't just a dreamer, just laugh, sort of uncut. He was a tinkerer. He spent years experimenting, and he probably failed a lot. Imagine him in his workshop surrounded by half-melted metal, broken wooden frames, and pages covered in smudged ink. Neighbors might have heard clanging, cursing, and the occasional crash. What's that crazy guy up to now? Yeah, the deep whisper. He even had to borrow money from a businessman named Johann Fuss to keep his experiments going. Laugh. So on, 'cause turning an idea into reality is expensive. Gold, wood, paper, ink, unco. None of it comes free, especially when you constantly starting over. Another thing, working in Gutenberg's favor, he lived in the right place at the right time. So Mainz was a busy trading city, full of merchants, scholars, and craftsmen. Ideas flowed as freely as wine in a tavern. He would have heard about paper coming from Italy, thanks to trade with the East, about the growing demand for books from universities in Paris and Heidelberg, and about how monks were struggling to keep up with copying orders. It was like maybe the whole world was just tapping its foot, waiting for a faster way to make books like Unki, and Gutenberg was the one who finally answered. He also had a secret weapon: frustration. Let's be real. So copying books by hand is tedious. Gutenberg was a smart guy, and smart guys hate wasting time. He probably thought, oh, there has to be a better way. That whole frustration drove him to connect dots like no one else saw. Laugh. On goldsmithing and grape presses, metal molds, and Latin letters. It says the same kind of frustration that makes someone invent a dishwasher or a remote control. Yeah, I am tired of doing this the hard way. By the 1430s, Gutenberg had moved to Strasbourg, maybe just to escape debt collectors in Mainz. Laugh, sort of like uncut. Oops. And there he started putting it all together. He hired workers who knew about woodworking, metal casting, and paper making. They built prototypes, tested different designs, and slowly, laugh. The pieces came together. It wasn't top glamorous. It was messy, noisy, and probably smelled like hot metal and sawdust. But that's how revolutions start, sort of like Unca, with a bunch of people in a workshop trying to solve a problem, one failed experiment at a time. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of what made Gutenberg is that invention stick, laugh, uncool. Literally, the metal movable type he created wasn't just like letters made of metal. It was a masterpiece of engineering, the kind of thing that makes you squint and think, oh, how did he even come up with that? Oh, because if you've ever tried to make 26 identical letters out of clay or wood, you know it's not harder than it looks. So metal, that's a whole other level of pain. So first, let's talk about the material. Gutenberg didn't just grab any old metal. He experimented with alloys like lath, a mix of lead, tin, and antimony. Those three, let's break it down like a medieval chemist, but with less guesswork. Lead is soft, which makes it easy to cast into shapes, but too soft on its own, sort of lath like unkill. It would wear down after a few prints. Tin adds hardness, so the letters hold their edges longer. Antimony, that's like the secret sauce. It makes the metal expand a little when it cools, which fills the mold perfectly. And it also makes the alloy more durable, like together. They literally like the three musketeers of metal laugh, just like each one making the others better. Try printing 100 pages with clay letters and I'll end up with smudges and cracks. Do it with Gutenberg, alloy, and the letters stay sharp enough for thousands of presses. Laugh, so handy, right? Then there's the mold to make identical letters. You need a way to replicate them perfectly. Gutenberg's solution, a two-part mold, probably made of copper. He decarved a reverse image of a letter into a small steel punch laugh. So, just like, is it like a stamp for? Then he de-hammered that punch into a piece of copper to make a negative called a matrix laugh. Then he declamped that matrix into a wooden frame, pour molten metal into it, and just pops a letter ready to use. The genius part, this system let him make hundreds of identical AS, BS, and the CS. No more hand carving each letter and hoping they match it. So like having a cookie cutter for words laugh, just like Unca, every batch comes out the same. But wait. Latin letters aren't all the same size. AW is wider than an I, and AB has a whole different shape than a whole. The Gutenberg had to make sure each letter was proportioned so they fit together neatly on a page. Laugh, uncut, what printers call justification. Ever see a book where the right edge is all jagged? That's bad justification. Laugh, Gutenberg, sill letters were designed to line up perfectly, just like soldiers in formation. He even made different sizes of the same letter, laugh. Some taller for capital letters, some shorter for lowercase. It sounds so trivial, but imagine reading a book where like a pest the same size as like an Ankisa, your eyes would revolt. This attention to detail made his printed pages look clean and professional, way better than a scribe. It's messy handwriting, no offense to scribes, but coffee breaks weren't just invented yet. Let's not forget the cost. Making these metal letters wasn't cheap. You needed skilled workers to carve the punches, melt the metal, and operate like the molds. Gutenberg probably blew through his borrowed money faster than a king, like blowing tax revenue on a new castle. A tier? The payoff, once you had a set of letters, you could reuse them infinitely. A scribe might spend a month copying a book, then just so have to start over for the next copy. Gutenberg, he could print 200 copies of a book with the same set of letters, then rearrange them to print something else. It's like buying a Lego set instead of a pre-built toy laugh. So just like sort of like clunky, you can make a castle today and a spaceship tomorrow. There was a learning curve. Of course, early letters were probably clunky. So with uneven edges, workers might have burned themselves on molten metal or spilled alloy on the floor. Cleanup must have been so fun. But by the 1440s, Gutenberg, a team, had it down to a science. They could produce thousands of letters in a week. So Each one consistent enough to look really good on the page. This wasn't just a new tool, laugh, just like Uncut. It was a manufacturing system and system scale. You can mass produce handwritten books, but with Gutenberg, see Metal Horzer, you can mass produce just about anything. It's easy to take standardized letters just for granted. Now we type on keyboards where every cue looks the same, and we actually print documents without a second thought. But in Gutenberg, time, this was revolution. It really turned writing from a kind art into something reproducible, laugh, like just uncut, something that could spread beyond the walls of monasteries and palaces. The metal letters were small, but they carried a big idea. Knowledge shouldn't be limited by how fast someone can write. It should be as abundant as the metal used to print it. Let's talk about the star of the show. The printing press itself, it's easy to imagine some fancy machine with gears and levers, but like Gutenberg's first press was probably more like a Frankenstein's monster of everyday parts. Think of it this way: if you needed to build a spaceship and only had a bicycle and a toaster, you do get creative like that. It's exactly what Gutenberg did, laugh. So like Uncle took a machine used to make wine and turned it into a tool that would rewrite history. The inspiration was so obvious. Once you looked around medieval Europe, the wine press farmers had been using them for centuries to squeeze juice from grapes. The basic design was simple: a heavy wooden frame, a flat platform where you put the grapes, and a big screw or lever that pressed down on a plate, squishing everything just below. Gutenberg probably watched one of these presses in action and thought, oh, what if instead of grapes, we put paper and inked letters there? Oh, it's not a kind of idea that sounds silly until you try it, laugh, and it worked. So he adapted the design. The core structure stayed a sturdy wooden frame because you need something strong enough to handle the pressure. But instead of a plate that squished grapes, he added like a bed where the metal type would just sit. This bed was a flat surface, usually made of wood, where the typesetter would arrange the letters into words and sentences. Then above it, he added a heavy wooden platen, the part that presses down to make the plate move. He kept the screw mechanism from the wine press. Turn the screw and the platen lowers, turn it back, and it rises. So simple, but brilliant. Let's just walk through how it worked, step by step, laugh, sort of like because even with all the parts, using the press was a bit of a dance. First, a worker would arrange the metal letters on the bed, making sure they were locked in place with wooden wedges. No one wants letters shifting mid-print. Then they ink the letters, not with a brush, laugh. On Gutenberg came up with a leather ball stuffed with wool, which they dip in ink and tap gently on the type. This way, the ink coated the letters evenly, not too much, not too little. Ever tried painting a wall with a drippy brush? Same idea, like sort of messy, uneven, frustrating. The ink ball solved that. Next, they lay a sheet of paper over the ink type. Then the printer would just crank the screw, lowering the platen onto the paper. They do press down hard, laugh, just hard, really hard onto. So the paper pressed into the inked letter. Then they crank the screw back up, lift the paper off, and there you go, a printed page. Laugh, sound easy. It wasn't the printer had to apply just the right amount of pressure. Too little, and the ink wouldn't transfer properly. Too much, and the paper would tear. It took strength and finesse, a laugh, like trying to spread peanut butter on bread with a sledgehammer. And let's not forget the speed. A fast scribe might copy 4 pages a day. A Gutenberg press with a good team, they could print 200 pages an hour. Let that sink in. Laugh. So in the time it took a scribe to finish one book, Gutenberg, a press could print dozens. It's like comparing a horse and buggy to a car. Just like same goal, but one gets you there a lot faster. Of course, there were kinks. The early presses were loud, on wood creaking, screws groaning, workers grunting as they turned to crank. They probably broke down a lot too. So, a splinter in the wood bed might ruin a whole sheet of paper. A rusty screw might get stuck, making the plate jam. And let's not talk about the mess, ink stains on hands, wood shavings on the floor. Paper scraps everywhere. Gutenberg sat to workshop. Wasn't he a clean, quiet lab? Laugh. Just sort of like Unca. It was a noisy, chaotic factory full of the smell of wood, metal, and ink. But here said the thing. It was reliable enough. The press didn't need magic or rare materials. It was made of wood and metal, so parts that any kind of carpenter or blacksmith could fix. That meant it could be replicated by the 1450s. Other craftsmen in Europe were building their own versions of Gutenberg's press, tweaking the design here and there. Laugh like Unca, maybe a better screw, maybe a sturdier frame, maybe a bigger bed for larger pages. It spread like wildfire because when something works and makes life easier or more profitable, people don't just ignore it. Gutenberg might not have invented the idea of a press, but he invented thirder, right? Like the press for the job. He took a tool that made wine and turned it into a tool that made knowledge accessible. It's a reminder that great inventions don't always come from nowhere, sort of like just key. They come from seeing what's already around you and asking what else can this do? Yeah. In the end, the printing press was more than wood and metal. It was a machine that pressed forward into a new era, one crank turn at a time. Let's pause for a second and talk about something that sounds boring but is actually a game changer. Ink. You might think, actually, it's just goop that makes letters show up laugh, sort of solve the big deal. Yeah, but trust me, if Gutenberg hadn't figured out the right recipe for ink, his printing press would been about as useful as a fork in a soup kitchen because the old stuff just didn't work. Before Gutenberg, scribes used ink made from iron gall. Just basically crushed oak galls, those bumpy things on trees, mixed with iron sulfate and water. It worked fine for quills and parchment. But try putting that on metal letters and pressing it onto paper. Disaster. Water-based ink sits on top of metal like a puddle on a plate, so it doesn't stick. When you press the paper down, the ink would smudge, bleed, or just wipe off, leaving you with a page that looks like a toddler's finger painting. Not exactly the professional look you want for a Bible. So Gutenberg had to go back to the drawing board. He needed ink that would cling to metal, dry quickly, and transfer cleanly to paper. And where do you go for inspiration when you're at Goldsmith? So, metalworking, laugh. Of course. Goldsmiths used oil-based varnishes to protect their work, laugh like uncut, sticky, thick, and perfect. For sticking to metal, Gutenberg probably thought, oh, what if I color this stuff and use it for printing? His first experiments were probably pretty messy. Imagine a workshop covered in smudges of brown, black, and maybe even red goop. He mixed linseed oil with charcoal or lamp black, soot from burning oil lamps, and cooked it over a fire to actually thicken it up. Too thin and it would run, too thick and it would clump, laugh. He added other ingredients like maybe a little wax to make it smoother or rosin to help it stick. It was like baking a cake without a recipe, sort of like uncake. You keep adding a pinch of this and a splash of that until it tastes right. The result, a thick, sticky, oil-based ink that was perfect for metal type. It clung to the letters like glue did. Run when pressed and dried fast enough so that you could print a page, flip it over, and print the other side without smearing. Laugh. Finally, those crisp, clean letters we associate with early printed books. Thank the ink. But let's not understate how big a deal this was. Scribes could mix their own ink in a pot with a stick. Gutenberg set ink required skill just like Unca, someone who knew how to cook the oil just right, like how to grind the pigment to the perfect consistency, how to adjust the recipe for different papers or weather. Too humid and the ink might take longer to dry, too dry, and it might crack. It was a craft within a craft. So this ink also played nice with paper, which was really good because paper was finally becoming more available in Europe. Parchment is smooth and absorbent, but paper has a slightly rough texture that grabs onto oil-based ink better.
It's like the difference between writing on glass and writing on notebook paper. Laugh like Uncle one holds the ink, the other repels it. Gutenberg saw ink and the rise of paper were a match made in heaven, even if they didn't know it at the time.
Think about it. Without the right ink, the printing press is just a fancy wood and metal contraption. It's just like the ink that turns the press into a tool that can make hundreds of identical pages. It's just the ink that makes the words last, so that lets a book printed in 1450 still be readable today. Scribes' ink fades over time, smears when it gets wet, but Gutenberg's oil-based ink, it's just tough. Laugh, it's like the difference between a post-it note and a carved stone. Like one is temporary, the other is built to last. And here, said the best part, once Gutenberg figured out the recipe, others could copy it. Ink makers popped up in cities with printing presses, churning out barrels of the kind of stuff. It wasn't a secret anymore. It was just a standard that somehow revolution spread. Laugh, like sort of like not with one genius working alone, but with a whole network of people figuring out the details, one sticky batch of ink at a time. So the next time you flip through a book, take a second to appreciate the ink. It's not just color on paper, it's the result of a guy in a workshop covered in soot thinking like, yeah, there's gotta be a better way to make this stick. And in the end, that better way just helped stick ideas into the minds of millions. Let's talk about the first big project off Gutenberg. Press laugh. Just sort of like the one that proved this whole printing thing wasn't just a weird hobby. It's called the Gutenberg Bible, or sometimes the 42-line Bible. And if you ever get to see one in a museum, you will probably gasp. Not because it's flashy laugh, uncut. There are no gold leaf pages or fancy illustrations like uncut, but because it's a lily perfect G for a world used to messy, hand-copied books. This thing was like a revelation. Gutenberg started working on it around 1452, and it took about 3 years to finish. 3 years sounds like a long time, but let that set. Just put it in perspective. A scribe would take a year to make one Bible. Gutenberg suppress. It made about 180 copies. Laugh on 30 on vellum, fancy parchment for rich folks, and 150 on paper for the slightly less rich. That's 180 Bibles, and the time it took one scribe to make 3. So like building a house in a day instead of a month, like sort of like people must have thought it was magic. But magic takes work. Let's break down what went into this Bible first, the type. Gutenberg didn't he just use any old letters, laugh, just like uncut piece, designed a font that looked like the handwriting of the best scribe. Back then, most Bibles were written in a style called Gothic script laugh, like uncode pointy, elaborate, with lots of flourishes. Gutenberg's metal letters mimicked that style, so the printed Bible looked familiar, not weird. It was a smart move. If he used like a totally new font, people might have rejected it as like too mechanical. Instead, he made the new technology look like the old art laugh, like sneaky but effective. Then there's the layout. Each page has 42 lines, hence the nickname, arranged in 2 columns, with margins wide enough for readers to add their own notes. Because even in 1455, people just loved annotating. Like book. The lines are straight. The letters are evenly spaced, and there's none of the squishing or stretching you see in hand-copied texts when a scribe realizes they're running out of room. It's so neat. So you could line a ruler up with the text and it would match perfectly. Scribes must have looked at it and sighed, laugh, like uncle. How do you compete with that? The printing process itself was a marathon. Each page required setting the type, inking it, pressing it, then taking the type apart to reuse for the next page. The Bible has 1282 pages, so that was 1282 setups, each with thousands of like letters. Gutenberg, team, laugh, uncut probably like a handful of workers, like could have split the job, one person setting, type, one inking, one operating the press, one folding and binding pages. It was a production line, medieval style, and they had to be careful, laugh, like just done one wrong letter, and every copy of that page would have a mistake. Can you imagine the pressure? Yeah. Oops, I put a ka instead of Tirkin, Kirkin, Chris, guess we have to redo 180 pages. Cost was another issue. Even though printing was cheaper than hand, copying the Bible wasn't exactly like a bargain. A paper copy, laugh, cost about 30 florins, just roughly a year. Est wages for a skilled work. But here was the thing, like before, a Bible cost 500 florins, laugh. So while it was still expensive, it was suddenly within reach of merchants, universities, and wealthy townsfolk, not just kings and bishops. It's like if a Ferrari suddenly started costing as much as a Toyo, like still not cheap, but a lot more people could dream of owning one. When the Bibles were finished, they caused a stir. Scholars marveled at how uniform they were, laugh. So, laugh on no more trying to compare two copies of a Bible and finding different story. Church leaders weren't sure what to think at first. Some saw it as a threat to their control over sacred texts. Others realized it could help spread religion faster. But most people, they were just really impressed. Laugh, here was a book that looked like it was written by an angel, sort of like perfect, consistent, and plentiful GT. Sadly, Gutenberg didn't get to enjoy his success. Laugh, remember Johann Fuss, the guy who lent him money? They had a falling just out over the cost of the Bible project. Fuss sued Gutenberg, won, and took over the press and just most of the Bible. Gutenberg died in 1468, poor and largely forgotten. It's like a lousy ending for a genius, but laugh, that's how history goes. Sometimes just like you invent something world-changing and someone else cashes in. But the Bible outlived him today. Only about 49 copies survive, and they reworth millions. So you can see them in libraries like the British Library or the Library of Congress, like behind glass cases under soft light. And when you look at them, you not just seeing the book, you seeing the moment when human knowledge stopped being a trickle and became a river. That first printed Bible didn't just tell stories of faith, So it started a story of its own. The story of how we learned to share ideas faster, farther, and more freely than ever before. Let's talk money. Just sort of like I saw talk money sort of changes the world quite like a good sale. Before Gutenberg, books were so expensive they might as well have been made of gold. A single hand-copied Bible cost the equivalent of a small farm, and even a short pamphlet could eat up a month sub wages for a laborer. But after the printing press rolled in, prices crashed faster than overripe apple from a tree. Suddenly books weren't just for kings and monks, they were for shopkeepers, teachers, and even the occasional curious farmer. Let's crunch the numbers. In 1450, a scribe might charge 10 florins to copy a decent-sized book, say, a collection of Aristotle set works like that. Son about what a skilled carpenter earned in a year. By 1500, thanks to printing the same book cost 1 florin, a 90% discount that's the kind of deal that makes people line up around the block. And it wasn't just about cost per book, just uncoal. It was about quantity. A printer could make 200 copies of a book in the time a scribe made one. So even if they charged less per copy, they still made more money. It starts the medieval version of selling 100 cheap burgers instead of one fancy steak. Unquote, more customers, more profit. This price drop happened for simple reasons. First, labor costs plummeted. Scribes spent hours hunched over a desk, and whatever time is money, printers they had machines doing the heavy lifting. Second, materials got cheaper, so paper, which was already replacing parchment, became even more affordable as demand grew, just like said. Factories popped up to make it, and more supply meant lower prices. Third, efficiency. A scribe might make mistakes that ruined a whole page, so printers could fix a typo by swapping out one metal letter, not redoing the entire book. Less waste equals so lower cost. The results laugh. So books flooded the market like rain after a drought in 1450. All of Europe had about 30,000 books total, like sort of most locked away in monasteries. By 1500, printers had cranked out between 15 and 20 million books. That's like going from one library in a city to a bookstore on every corner. Suddenly, you didn't have to beg a monk to let you peek at a manuscript. Laugh. You could buy your own copy. Imagine the thrill of holding a book that, not or your cell, not just borrowed or stolen, something you could underline dog ear or even lend to a friend without fear of angering a bishop. This explosion of cheap books created a whole new economy. So booksellers set up shops in busy marketplaces, hanging signs with pictures of open books to attract customers who couldn't read. Printers started specializing. Some focused on Bibles, others on medical texts or travel stories. There were even paperback versions, small, cheap books bound in simple paper covers, perfect for tucking into a pocket. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a beach read. Minus the beach, not everyone was so thrilled. Of course, scribes were suddenly out of work, and some grumbled that printed books were soulless compared to hand-copied ones. Monasteries, which had controlled most book production, saw their power fade. So uncle, I donate to a scriptorium when you could buy a book down the street, but progress waits for no one, and the demand for cheap books was too strong to stop. A merchant in Antwerp might buy a printed guide to trade routes, so a doctor in Paris could study a medical textbook. A mother in London might purchase a prayer book for her children. Whatever book stopped being symbols of wealth and became tools like useful everyday things. So this democratization of reading changed lives in small, quiet ways. A tailor might learn arithmetic from a cheap textbook and start keeping better track of his profit. A teacher could buy multiple copies of a grammar book, so her students didn't have to share one tattered manuscript. A sailor might read a printed map and realize there sets a faster route to India. These small changes added up, like drops of water, like carving a canyon. It's easy to forget how revolutionary this was today. We can download a book for free with a click. But in 1500, being able to afford a book was a big deal. It meant you could just learn without a teacher, think without a priest looking over your shoulder, and share ideas with people who lived just miles away. The printing press didn't just make books cheaper, uncoco. It made knowledge more democratic, and once knowledge is in the hands of more people, there's no telling what they'll do with it. Let's imagine a world where news travels at the speed of a horse. That's what life was like before the printing press. A letter from Rome to London might take a month to arrive, if it actually arrived at all. A new idea, just like scientific discovery, a religious argument, a clever joke, could take years to spread beyond its hometown. But after Gutenberg's invention, information started moving like a river breaking through a dam, fast and unstoppable. Take the example of a new medical textbook written by a doctor in Padua, Italy, around 1480, before printing. He might have hand-copied a few dozen versions and sent them to colleagues. He just knew. Maybe a monk in Paris would just copy it, then maybe a scribe in Vienna. But by the time it reached London, the text would be full of mistakes and the doctor might be long dead. So with printing, the doctor could work with a printer to make 500 copies. Merchants would carry them on ships and carts, selling them to bookstores like in Paris, London, and even as far as Constantinople. Within a year, doctors across Europe would be reading the same text, debating the same ideas, and improving on each other. Tied work. It's like switching from sending smoke signals to sending emails like laugh, like Anka. Suddenly, everyone's on the same page, literally. This speed changed how people learned. So before, education was about memorization. If you wanted to learn Aristotle's philosophy, you'd have to memorize what your teacher told you, because books were just too rare to check. But with cheap printed books, students could read Aristotle for themselves. They could compare his ideas to Plato, write notes in the margins, and even just argue with the ancient philosopher. Teachers had to step up their game, laugh like UV break unta, no more making up facts when students could fact check them with a book. It's like when calculators were invented, unka suddenly math class wasn't it just about memorizing multiplication tables, it was about understanding why the numbers worked. New ideas also got a boost. Let's say a scholar in Prague came up with a new theory about the stars. Before printing, he might share it with a few friends and like it. With printing, he could publish a pamphlet, uncut, short, cheap, easy to carry, laugh. So uncut, and suddenly astronomers in Nuremberg, Lisbon, and Warsaw are reading it. They might write their own pamphlets in response, agreeing or disagreeing. And pretty soon, they debate happening across the continent, this back and so forth. This rapid exchange of ideas is what fuels progress. It's like a group of people trying to solve a puzzle, laugh, uncle. If they all share their pieces quickly, they finish faster. Even rumors and news traveled better. So in 1493, when Columbus returned from his first voyage to the Americas, printers in Barcelona churned out accounts of his journey. Within weeks, versions of the story were printed in Paris, Antwerp, and Rome. People who never heard of the Americas before were suddenly talking about new worlds and strange people. It wasn't just news, laugh, just Anka. It was inspiration. Other explorers read those pamphlets and thought, oh, I want to find a better route. Investors read them and thought, oh, there's some money to be made without printing. Columbus' discovery might have stayed a local curiosity for years, not the spark that led to global exploration. This acceleration also meant that bad ideas spread faster, too. A false story about a plague in a distant city could cause panic before anyone could prove it was just a lie. A radical religious pamphlet could stir up trouble before the church could respond. But here, this is the whole thing. Printing also made it easier to correct mistakes. For every false plague story, there could be a printed rebuttal from a whole doctor. For every radical pamphlet, a church scholar could publish a counter-argument. It's like having a conversation instead of a monologue, laugh. So just sort of uncut, messy sometimes, but more likely to get to the truth. People started to think differently. Two, when you can read about what's actually happening in other countries, when you can compare your own culture to others, you start to question things. A farmer in France might read about how farmers in England grow better crops and think, oh, why don't we try that? Yeah. A merchant in Venice might read a book about Islamic mathematics and realize there's a better way to keep accounts. The whole world felt smaller and connected, and that made people curious, laugh, curious to learn, to explore, to improve. In the end, the printing press didn't just spread knowledge, laugh, so just sort of uncut. It changed the GPA of knowledge. It turned a slow trickling stream into a rushing river carrying ideas to places they'd never been before. And once that river started flowing, there was no way to dam it up again. Laugh, progress. It turns out love's a good tailwind, like Gontisan. Printing was the strongest tailwind the world had ever seen. Let's talk about a fight laugh, just sort of like one that started with a few pieces of paper and ended up shaking the foundations of Europe. The Protestant Reformation wasn't just argument about religion. It was a showcase of what happens when ideas can spread faster than the people trying to stop them. And at the center of it all, the printing press. Martin Luther might have nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517, but it was like Gutenberg's invention laugh that turned those Ds into like a revolution. Let's set the scene. So in 1517, the Catholic Church was the biggest power in Europe. It controlled not just religion, but politics, education, and even just how people thought about right and wrong. One of its big money, so makers' indulgences laugh like uncall papers you could buy to forgive your sins, or the sins of dead relatives. It was like a get out of hell free card, and it made the church rich. Martin Luther, a grumpy monk from Germany, thought this was a scam. So he wrote down 95 reasons why indulgences were so wrong, nailed into the door of Wittenberg Castle Church, and figured that would start a little debate among other monks. He had no idea what he was just starting. Here's where printing comes in. Luther wrote his These in Latin, the language of scholars and priests, but within weeks, someone just laugh, probably a sympathetic printer, just untranslated them into German, the everyday language of the people. Then they hit print. Suddenly, thousands of copies were circulating in Germany. By the end of 1517, Luther's 95, these had been printed just in 30 different cities. By 1520, there were probably over 300,000 copies of his writings in circulation. That's like a viral tweet. But in 16th century terms, laugh, uncut instead of trending for a day, it changed history. The church was caught off guard. They were used to dealing with heretics by burning their books and silencing them. But with printing, for every book they burned, printers could make 100 more. When the Pope excommunicated Luther in 1521, Luther responded by writing a pamphlet called On the Freedom of a Christian, which sold 50,000 copies in 2 weeks. Laugh. It was like trying to put out a wildfire with a squirt gun, sort of like every time they tried to stop it, the flame spread further. Printing. Also let Luther speak directly to the people, just bypassing the church. He translated the Bible into German, so ordinary folks could read it for themselves instead of relying on priests to tell them exactly what it said. Before, the church had a monopoly on interpreting the Bible, just sort of like laugh. They were like the only person with the instruction manual. Luther's German Bible changed that by 1534. It was a bestseller, with printers churning out copies faster than they could keep up. People gathered in taverns and homes to read it aloud, arguing about what it meant. It was revolutionary. So suddenly, you didn't need a priest to have a relationship with God. You could just read the words yourself. Of course, the church fought back. They banned Luther's cess books, declared printers who published them heretics, and even burned some kind of at the stake. It was too late. Printing had made ideas too hard to control. A bookseller in Leipzig could smuggle copies to Frankfurt. A farmer could hide a pamphlet in his hay cart. A student could tuck one into his satchel and carry it across the country. The more the church tried to censor, the more people wanted to read what was being banned. Laugh, so just see the oldest trick in the book, and it worked. Luther wasn't the only one using printing. So other reformers like John Calvin in Switzerland and Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich published their own pamphlets and books. Each one added fuel to the fire, creating a network of ideas that spanned Europe. Printers became unlikely revolutionaries, making money while spreading new ways of thinking. It's a funny laugh, like Gutenberg was probably a good Catholic, but his invention helped split the church he likely revered. History has a weird sense of humor that way. By the mid-1500s, Europe was divided. Maybe some countries stayed Catholic, Others became Protestant. Wars would rage for decades over this split, but the damage to the church's monopoly was done. People had tasted the power of reading for themselves, of thinking critically about authority, and it was all possible because of printing. Luther once said, yeah, printing is just God's highest and extremist act of grace, and he wasn't wrong. Laugh, it turned his little debate into a movement, like his 95 Theses into a revolution, and a world where one church controlled everything into a world where ideas could compete, sort of like no matter how much the powers that be tried to stop them. Let's shift from arguments about God to arguments about stars, planets, and why things fall down instead of up to scientific revolution. Laugh, just like unquote the period when people started asking how, oh, and why, yeah, instead of just accepting because the Bible says so. Uncut didn't happen in a vacuum. It just happened because printers turned lab notes into bestsellers, and suddenly a scientist in Poland could argue with a scholar in Italy without ever meeting. So, spoiler, the printing press was the Wi-Fi of the 16th century, and it let science go viral. Before Gutenberg, science was a lonely business. Maybe a mathematician might spend years working on a theory, scribble it down in a notebook, and maybe share it with a few friends. If she died, the notebook might just get lost, and all that work would vanish. Laugh, sort of like a Snapchat that no one screenshot, but with printing, her ideas could outlive her. Take Nicolaus Copernicus, the guy who said the Earth orbits the sun, not the other way around. He wrote his book on the revolutions of the celestial spheres, Laugh Rotter, in the early 1500s, but was scared to publish it. Like Anka, church leaders hated the idea that Earth wasn't truth, the center of the universe. He finally agreed to print it in 1543, just before he died. By then, it was too late to silence him. The book spread across Europe, and even though many people called it heresy, others read it and thought, oh, that makes sense. So printing didn't just preserve ideas like Laugh, like Uncut, and let scientists check each other, side of work. Galileo Galilei, the Italian astronomer who built a better telescope, published his observations in 1610 in a little book called Book Sidereus Nuncistratus, the Starry Messenger. In it, he just described seeing moons orbiting Jupiter, just like Laugh, on proof that not everything circles Earth. Printers pumped out copies, and suddenly astronomers all over Europe were pointing their telescopes at Jupiter to see if Galileo was telling the truth. Some called him a liar, but others confirmed his findings. It's like a group project where everyone can fact check the guy who claims he did the work. Laugh. So just like Anka, except instead of a school project, it was figuring out how the universe worked. Then there's the issue of math. So before printed books, mathematical formulas were a mess. Scribes would miscopy numbers, mix up symbols, and turn simple equations into gibberish. But with printed math books, formulas were clear and consistent. A student in France could learn the same algebra as a student in England, just using the same symbol. This might sound boring, but it's just huge. Laugh. Imagine trying to build a spaceship if everyone uses different units for distance. Just unchaos printing turned math into a universal language, and that let scientists build on each other so it worked instead of starting over. Francis Bacon, the English philosopher who promoted the scientific method, observe, hypothesize, test, repeat, was a big fan of printing. He once said that printing, gunpowder, and the compass were the three inventions that changed the whole face and state of things throughout the world. He knew that printing wasn't just about books. Laugh, just sort of like Uncut. It was about creating a community of thinkers, all working toward the same goal, understanding nature. Thanks to printed journals, the 17th century version of research papers, scientists could share their experiments, admit their mistakes, and ask for help. It's like having a global lab where everyone's invited. Even medical science just got a boost. Andreas Vesalius, a 16th century doctor, hated that doctors were still using anatomy books written 1,300 years earlier by Galen, a Greek physician. So he dissected human bodies himself, drew what he saw, and published G. Humani Corporis Fabris Evalvopaca, laughed and like it of the structure of the human body in 1543. It was so full of detailed, accurate illustrations like Unca, something that would have been impossible to copy by hand. Doctors across Europe bought it, and suddenly they were learning from real bodies, not ancient texts. Surgery got better, diseases were diagnosed more accurately, and people stopped dying from treatments that never worked, all because a printer could reproduce, like Vesalius, drawings perfectly. Of course, not everyone loved this new scientific approach. The church still had power, and so they didn't like scientists questioning the Bible. Galileo was put on trial for saying Earth moves, and his books were just banned. But here's the thing, even banned books got printed. So printers in Protestant countries where the church had less control kept churning out copies of Galileo's work. By the time the church admitted he was right, centuries later, his ideas were already part of science. Printing made censorship a losing battle, like unq can burn a book, but you can burn the idea if it's already in 100 other books. By the 1700s, the scientific revolution was in full swing. So Isaac Newton published his De Principia Mathematicae Geist, which explained gravity and motion, and it became a bestseller. Printers made sure it was available in universities, libraries, and even wealthy homes. Newton-sized ideas didn't just stay in England. So they spread to France, Germany, and beyond. So inspiring new discovery. It's amazing to think a man sitting under an apple tree maybe comes up with a theory, writes it down, and because of printing, that theory really changes how we understand the entire universe. In the end, printing turned science from a hobby for rich guys with too much time on their hands into a global collaborative effort. It let ideas clash, grow, and evolve probably faster than ever before. And that's the real magic of science. Sort of like unco. No one has all the answers, but together we can find them. Thanks, Gutenberg. Even if you never knew what you were starting. Let's talk about how printing turned talking like your neighbor into like being part of a nation. So before the printing press, Europe was a jumble of dialects. A person from northern England might barely understand someone from London, let alone Paris or Madrid. But printing it picked a few winner dialects, polished them up, and turned them into national languages. Suddenly, people didn't just think of themselves as, oh, from this village, or oh, that town, So they thought of themselves as English, French, or German. And that shift, it really changed the map of Europe. So here said the thing about hand-copied books, they adapted to local dialects. A scribe in Scotland might write a story with Scottish words, while a scribe in England would use English ones. There was no correct way to spell or speak Like language was as fluid as a river, but printers hate chaos to make money. They needed to sell books to as many people as possible. So they picked a dialect that was widely understood, usually the one spoken in the capital city where the money and power were in England. That was the dialect of London. So in France, it was Parisian French. In Spain, Castilian Spanish. These became the standard languages of printed books. Why does this matter? Because when you read a book in a certain dialect, you start to think of that dialect as, proper, like a merchant in York reading a London printed book might start using London words to sound more educated. A farmer in Provence reading a Parisian book might notice that his way of speaking is different, laugh like sort of like uncut, and maybe start to adjust over time. These printed languages smoothed out the rough edges of regional dialects, creating a common way of speaking that tied people together. It's like how television shows today make people from different parts of a country use the same slang, sort of uncut, except instead of Netflix, it was printers in the 1500s. Take the Bible, for example. When Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, the dialect of Saxony, where he lived, he didn't just make religion accessible, laugh. So he created a standard German language. So his translation was so popular that printers across Germany used it as a model, laugh. Suddenly, a person in Bavaria and a person in Prussia who could barely understand each other's speech could read the same Bible and understand the same words. They might still argue about beer and politics, but they shared a language like auntie, and that made them feel like they were part of the same group. Germans? The same thing happened in England. William Tyndale translated the Bible into English in the 1520s using the London dialect. So when Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church and made English the language of religion, Tyndale's translation and later the King James Bible became the foundation of modern English. It standardized spelling, popularized new words, and gave people a shared literary heritage. So you think eye for an eye, or actually the apple of my eye, are just old sayings, laugh. Thank Tyndale's print. This wasn't just about words, laugh, like unkey. It was about identity before, like loyalty was to your lord or your town. But with a common language, people started to feel loyalty to a nation. A French speaker in Lyon might never have visited Paris, but when she read a French book, she thought, oh, this is my language, my culture. When kings wanted to unify their countries, they used printed books to spread their version of history, law, and culture. It's like a national team jersey, laugh like uncle, wearing the same language, made people feel like they were on the same team. Of course. Not everyone was happy. Regional dialects started to just die out as parents taught their kids the standard language to help them get ahead. Local cultures lost some of their uniqueness, replaced by a more uniform national culture. It's a trade-off, laugh, we still see today, just like uncut globalization brings people together, but sometimes erases small, beautiful differences. But in the 1500s and 1600s, this unification was powerful. It helped create modern nation states where people are bound not just by geography, but by a shared way of speaking and thinking. Printed dictionaries and grammar books cemented this in 1694. The French Academy published its first dictionary, trying to fix the French language and keep it from changing. Other countries followed, creating rule books for their languages. Suddenly, there was a whole right and wrong way to speak, laugh, something that had never really existed before. Teachers used these books in schools, making sure every child learned the standard language. It just saw how we learn grammar in school today. Laugh, don't you just pick it up from your parents, you get it from a book printed and standardized. By the 1700s, the map of Europe looked more like it does today, with distinct countries, each with its own language and identity. And while wars and politics played a role, none of it really would have happened just as quickly without printing. Language, once a messy local thing, became a tool for unity. It turned us v's them from village v's, laugh, village, to country v's, country, unca, and in doing so shaped the modern world. So the next time you complain about spelling tests or grammar rules, blame Gutenberg, laugh, or thank him, because without printed books, we might still be arguing about whether color or color is correct, unca, except we'd be doing it in 100 different dialects and no one would understand each other. Let's pack our bags and follow the printing press as it leaves Europe and hits the road. This isn't a quick trip, laugh, just solid, a slow meandering journey. That takes centuries, unquote. But by the end, it's set everywhere in marketplaces in India, in temples, in Japan, in colonial towns in Mexico. And wherever it goes, it shakes things up because the need to share ideas isn't just a whole European thing. So humans, it turns out, love to write stuff down and pass it around, laugh sort of no matter where they live. First stop, the Ottoman Empire. By the 1490s, European printers were already sneaking presses into cities like Istanbul, even though the Ottoman authorities were so wary of this newfangled machine. Why the hesitation? Laugh. Well, Arabic script, just sort of like unco with its flowing connected letters, unco is trickier to turn into metal type than Latin letters. Each letter changes shape depending on where it is in a word, which means more types to cast. But by the 1720s, a Hungarian convert to Islam named Ibrahim Mutafarika set up the first official Ottoman printing press. He printed medical books, histories, and geography texts, sort of like practical stuff, like the empire needed to keep up with Europe. Suddenly, Ottoman scholars could read the latest European ideas without waiting for hand copies, and that helped the empire stay in the game a little longer. Next, let's head east to India. So Portuguese missionaries brought the first printing press to Goa in 1556, mainly to print Christian texts in local languages just like Tamil and Malayalam. But Indians quickly realized this machine could do more than just spread religion. By the 1700s, printers in Calcutta and Madras were churning out legal documents, trade records, and even poetry. The British East India Company loved it. So sort of like printing made it easier to govern a huge, diverse country that printed tax laws in Hindi, Urdu, and Bengali. So everyone knew what they owed. And Indian reformers, they used presses to spread ideas about ending practices like sati, widow, like burning, and promoting education for women. A press in Bombay in the 1820s printed newspapers that criticized British rule, just like on proof that printing isn't just for empires, it's for resistance too. Crossing the Pacific, so we reach Japan. The first printing press arrived in 1590, brought by Jesuit missionaries. They printed religious books in Japanese using a mix of European metal type and local woodblocks for the more complex character. But when Japan closed itself off to foreigners in the 1630s, the Edo period, the presses were banned. So like uncle leaders worried they spread dangerous foreign ideas. Smart move, not really. By the 1800s, when Japan realized it needed to modernize to compete with Europe, they dusted off those old printing techniques. They adapted European presses to print Japanese characters, cranked out books on science like military strategy and Western technology, and boom, So Japan went from isolation to industrialization in a few decades. Printing didn't cause the Meiji Restoration, but it really sure helped speed it up. Let's sail to Mexico, where Spanish conquistadors actually brought presses as early as 1539. So just 20 years after Cortés conquered the Aztecs, the first book printed in the Americas was a catechism meant to convert indigenous people to Christianity. But like everywhere else, the press quickly found other uses. Printers in Mexico City printed land deeds, tax records, and even plays about local life. They also printed dictionaries that mixed Spanish and indigenous languages, helping missionaries and colonists communicate. But that's the twist. So indigenous leaders started using those same presses to preserve their own histories and traditions, writing down stories that had been told orally for centuries. Suddenly, a culture at risk of being erased had a way to fight back, just like down to Africa, where printing took a little longer to catch on, but when it did, it made waves. So the first press in sub-Saharan Africa was set up in Sierra Leone in 1800 by British abolitionists who used it to print anti-slavery pamphlets and religious kind of texts. By the 1850s, Presses in South Africa were printing newspapers in English, Dutch, and Xhosa. These newspapers became voices for black and white communities alike, just sort of like unka arguing about politics, sharing news, and shaping public opinion. In Egypt, after the 1805 rise of Muhammad Ali, presses printed books on engineering and agriculture, helping modernize the country. And in Ethiopia, a press set up in 1863 printed religious texts in Amharic, strengthening the country as unique, so Christian sort of heritage. What's amazing about this global journey is how printing adapted in Europe. It was all about Latin and metal type. So in India, it mixed Latin letters with Devanagari script. In Japan, it blended metal type with wood blocks. In the Americas, it juggled Spanish, indigenous languages, and later English printing did arrive as a one-size-fits-all machine. Vatha need change to fit local needs, like a traveler learning the local language. And that's why it spread. It wasn't patented because people saw how useful it was. By the 1800s, the printing press was as common as a blacksmith's shop in most parts of the world. So it had gone from a European curiosity to a global tool used by kings and rebels like priests and scientists, teachers and storytellers. It didn't just carry European ideas to other countries like it carried all their ideas, creating a network of knowledge that spanned continents for the first time in history. A person in China could read about a scientific discovery in France, or a poet in Nigeria could publish a book that was read in Brazil. The world was just getting smaller, and it was all thanks to a machine that squeezed ink onto paper. Let's zoom out, way out, and see what Gutenberg, some little machine in Mainz, started. It just like dropping a pebble in a pond. Just laugh, until the ripples spread so far you can even see where they end. The printing press didn't just change how we make books. So it changed how we think, how we govern, how we connect. It's the reason you can read this now, the reason your school has a library, the reason ideas just like laugh on good and bad, just like let us trace those ripples. First, education. Before printing, schools were rare and most people were illiterate. Why learn to read if there's nothing to read but with cheap books? Laugh. So suddenly, there's a reason. By the 1600s, schools were popping up across Europe, teaching kids to read, laugh like uncle. First religious texts, then history, science, and even novels. Literacy rates climbed slowly. Surely. By 1800, half of all Europeans could read, compared to maybe 10% in 1500. That maybe is a revolution in itself. An educated population doesn't just follow orders, it asks questions. It demands better governments, better laws, better lives. And that demand, it led to revolutions. Laugh like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, where ordinary people armed with ideas from printed books said, we can do this better. Then there's the commerce. Printed books and pamphlets made trade easier. Merchants could buy guidebooks with maps of trade routes, lists of foreign currencies, and so tips on how to negotiate with people from other countries. Printers churned out catalogs of goods like unka silk from China, spices from India, cloth from England, laugh like unka. So buyers knew what was available. Even advertising was born. Small printed flyers promoting a new shop or a sale. Suddenly, business wasn't just about who you knew. It was about what you knew. Laugh. So just like unka, and you could learn it from a book. This explosion of trade helped create the modern global economy, where goods and ideas cross borders as easily as a farmer crosses a field. Let's not forget entertainment. Before printing, stories were just told around fires or performed in theaters, but with printed books, stories could travel. A novel written in Spain could be read in France, then translated into English, then adapted into a play in Germany. Shakespeare's plays were printed and spread across Europe, making him a global star even in his lifetime. By the 1700s, novels like Laugh, sort of like Uncle, long stories about ordinary people, Uncle, were all the rage. People could escape into tales of love, adventure, and mystery, all from the comfort of their homes. Printing turned storytelling from a live event into something you could hold in your hands, something you could read again and again. It made us all dream bigger because we could just read about lives so different from our own. Science and technology, as we've seen, got a turbo boost, but let's size. To connect the dots to today, the printing press led to faster communication, which led to more scientific discoveries, which led to the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines, factories, railroads, laugh, just like so. None of these would have spread as quickly without printed manuals, engineering diagrams, and technical books. A factory owner in Manchester could read about a new loom design from Paris, build it, and start producing cloth faster. A train engineer could study a printed manual to fix a broken engine. Printing turned innovation into a team sport with everyone sharing their playbooks. Politics changed too. Newspapers, which started as small printed pamphlets in the 1600s, became really powerful tools. They reported on wars, criticized kings, and spread ideas about democracy. Thomas Paine, with Common Sense, laugh, sorter, a pamphlet arguing for American independence, sold 500,000 copies in 1776, just more than any book before. It didn't just convince people to support the revolution, so it made them believe they could win. Later, newspapers helped build public opinion for causes like ending slavery, giving women the right to vote, and protecting the environment. Whatever they turned public opinion from like a vague idea into a force that could change like law. And let's talk about you laugh, the fact that you can read so that you have access to books so that you can learn about history, science, or art like Uncall. All of that traces back to Gutenberg. The printing press didn't he just invent a machine? So it invented a world where knowledge is accessible, laugh, where ideas matter, where anyone just could, no matter how poor or where they were born, just unquote can learn and grow. It's not perfect, of course. There are still people who can read, still ideas that get silenced, still books that get banned, laugh, compared to a world where only just a handful of people owned books. We've come a long way. Gutenberg probably never imagined any of this. Maybe he was just trying to make a better Bible, maybe make some money. But like that psych, the beauty of great inventions, laugh, just they take on a life of their own. The printing press started as a way to copy words, but it ended up copying ideas, dreams, and revolutions. It's a reminder that even the smallest idea, when shared, can really change the world. The ripples from that first printing press in Maine are still spreading even now. Every time you open a book, scroll through a screen, or share an idea with someone far away, you're like, just be part of that story. It's a quiet revolution, really laugh. Just like unto no explosions, no fanfare, just the steady hum of words being shared, ideas taking root, and people learning to see the world a little differently. So as you drift off, think of it, all the knowledge, all the stories, all the dreams that started with a man and a machine, like a pile of metal letters and a whole lot of ink sweet dreams. And here, so to the next chapter.